So, you want to make an arcane build, right? I just have one question for you. Do you like dealing absolutely absurd amounts of damage? Yes. I lied, I have one more question. Do you like dealing absolutely absurd damage over time? Yes. Do you like having a diverse array of tools available that allow you to adapt to every situation? Yes. Do you hate yourself as much as I do? Probably not. Then don't worry, because I've spent a solid 4,000 hours of my life digging through the game's code and learning all of the ins and outs of the mechanics of Dark Souls games so that you don't have to. So sit back and relax while I teach you how to build your very own mathematically optimized arcane build. Hi, my name's Rust. I'm a Soulsborne content creator with an emphasis on PvP. For the first few years of Elden Ring's launch, arcane builds dominated both the PvE and the PvP scenes, winning tournaments from left and right, and obliterating bosses in a matter of seconds. Then, everything changed when
From Software
attacked. FromSoft stepped in and started nerfing the hell out of arcane builds, starting with nerfing prominent weapons like Rivers of Blood and Mohg's Spear, and eventually even nerfing the amount of status buildup that you get from power stancing weapons. You thought that 2 was better than 1. What, you thought that a Dark Souls game was gonna make sense?
You serious?
Now, if you thought that making a mathematically optimized arcane build was as simple as handing you a stat spread on a silver platter, handing you a weapon, and sending you on your way, then unfortunately you're mistaken. Buckle up, because I'm about to fill your head with all the useless game knowledge that I've collected over the past 4 years of playing these games competitively. This includes what infusions that you choose, optimizing your stat spreads around various soft caps on damage, status buildup, and spell power, and all the various tools, consumables, weapons, and even some glitches that can help you push your damage to higher values than you could ever achieve with other builds. So be sure to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you found this information helpful to you at all, or if you're just more confused than ever. For the purposes of this video, we'll be optimizing around a level 150 character. This is regarded by the general community as the accepted meta level, where if you're looking to engage in PvP, then this is the level that you should stay at. It is worth noting that the higher level that you get, the more efficient arcane builds become. So, if you're one of those weirdos who decides to farm all the nerfs for 9 hours of their life, first off, fuck you, leave my boys alone, and second, a lot of the principles about damage scaling will still apply to you, so stick around. There's 3 different build variants that you can optimize for, being either Strength Arcane, Dex Arcane, or Pure Caster. Choosing which build that you want to go with really just comes down to what weapons that you want to use. One mistake I see a lot of people make is that they pigeonhole themselves into only having access to 1 or 2 weapons and start naming their builds like Rivers of Blood build or Dragon Crucible Knight that sometimes uses a halberd build, but I really want to stress the importance of versatility and adaptability when making your builds. Let's get started. There's one rule of thumb that applies to any build type that you make, which is first, level Vigor. Then, hit your relevant soft caps on your damage stats, and dump the leftovers into Endurance to maximize your armor and defenses. The first part is simple. Vigor scales really well up to 60 points of investment, where suddenly takes a nosedive and becomes completely worthless. You might sit there and argue with me that, well, you know, if I don't get hit, then I don't need help. Shut up. Shut your mouth. We've all seen how you play. Level Vigor. Next, your damage soft caps. Unlike most builds, there are 3 different types of damage soft caps that you need to keep in mind when building for Arcane. Your weapon damage, your spell power, and your status buildup. Status buildup is always purely Arcane scaling stat, where if something is bleed infused, then you won't get any extra buildup from investing into strength or dexterity, and only stats invested into Arcane will further increase the buildup. That said, simply having innate bleed on a weapon doesn't make it scale with your Arcane. It specifically has to be infused with one of the 3 infusion types that denote a letter scaling with Arcane, these being Bleed, Poison, and Occult Infusion. Status scaling has a very clear breakpoint where further points of investment get drastically reduced, giving less than half the amount of buildup per point invested on anything over 45 Arcane. So whether you're using a weapon with innate bleed scaling on an Occult Infusion, or if you're using something that's infused with bleed or poison, it's never worth raising your Arcane over 45 for the purposes of raising your status buildup. Greases, which can be applied to certain weapons, can apply various status effects, and of these, bleed, poison, and sleep greases each scale with Arcane. However, they only receive that scaling when applied to a weapon that has a letter scaling in Arcane. But bleed, poison, and occult infused weapons cannot have greases applied to them, making this number of weapons that can actually receive scaling from greases very limited. There are only 3 weapons in the game that can receive this benefit, being the Ripple Blade, Ripple Halberd, and Vari's Bouquet. When applied to these weapons, Greases, which would normally deal a set amount of buildup, instead get a boosted effect from your arcane investment, allowing something like a Ripple Blade to put someone to sleep in as little as 2 or 3 hits, due to its S scaling in Arcane. The only types of status greases that don't scale with Arcane are Frost and Rot greases, so applying Rot grease or Freezing grease won't give you any extra buildup than if you were using something like a pure strength build. But damage scaling works a little differently. For various infusions, a weapon may receive a letter scaling into one of 3 stats, and each stat that gets a scaling from that infusion gets assigned a particular graph that determines its soft cap. Something like a heavy infusion on a warped axe is really simple, as it only gets a letter scaling into one stat, being strength. So, for every stat invested into strength, the damage goes up, and stats invested in anything else do nothing. Arcane stat scaling is a lot more complicated, since they scale with a combination of strength, dexterity, and arcane, and all of them receive the same graph. So in theory, to hit the maximum soft cap on damage, you need to hit the damage soft cap in all 3 categories. But to do so, you'd need to be something like level 500, and ain't no one got time for that. Instead, we prioritize which stat hits their soft cap depending on which letter grade is assigned to them. Here, we're talking about the power of the scaling, where things with a D or E rank scaling only get a fraction of the amount of damage that you would get from investing into a stat with A or S rank scaling. Take something like a Clean Rot Knight Sword as an example. On a Bleed Infusion, this weapon gets a C rank scaling in Strength and a D rank in both Dex and Arcane. This means that up until you hit the final soft cap in Strength, you will always get more damage per point of investment by putting stats into Strength than you would into Dex or Arcane. Now normally, the soft cap on damage for a bleed infused weapon is all the way up at 80 points of investment, but weapons that have a strong affinity for strength scaling get a bit of a hidden buff. Anytime that you're two-handing a weapon, you get 50% extra artificial strength added to your damage. So, in order to hit your 80 strength soft cap, then you only need 54 points of investment. This makes the Strength Arcane Build variant very appealing because it makes it really easy to hit your major damage soft caps at level 150 while still having plenty of points available to further invest into your defenses. And while we're going to talk about all 3 build variants, the strength leaning version is the one that I would recommend the most. But there's an important question that we have yet to get answered. Do we go with Bleed or Occult Infusion? Bleed Infusion will give any weapon, whether or not it has innate bleed, a set amount of bleed scaling. The damage scaling on bleed infused weapons from your arcane stat tends to be very low, usually with something like a D rank, but they come with a very high amount of bleed buildup. And despite its low letter grade, the bleed scaling tends to be a lot higher on bleed infused weapons than anything you could get from an occult infusion, and in some cases, it even does higher base damage as well. What a lot of people don't realize is that you don't need to have weapons with innate bleed buildup to make them viable on an arcane build. Now that we have that sorted, let's get into build crafting. The Strength Arcane variant is what, in my opinion, is the best version of these 3 builds, with access to a wide variety of extremely powerful weapons and tools that can really help you out in a tight spot. To optimize your damage on this build, you'll want to be running a hero starting class for the increased base arcane and strength stats, which make hitting your damage soft caps a lot easier. Weapons that scale well with this type of build include things like the Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword, Bloodfiend Sacred Spear, and Moog's Spear. The Greatsword is an amazing weapon that functions well either as your primary or as a swap to gap close to your target. The damage has split damage scaling between physical and magic, but the physical scaling alone provides even more damage than you would get with the bleed infused Uggs. The only downside is that this weapon doesn't have any status buildup, but to be honest, I actually think that's a good thing. Allow me to explain. In order to ever land a hit on a player, 2 checks have to confirm, being 1, that you see your hitbox cross the opponent's character model on your screen, and on their screen, they have to be outside of iframes at the time that that hit connects. If you see your hit connect, but they see themselves roll away at the correct timing, such that they're in iframes on their screen when it lands, then they'll receive what's called a phantom hit. A phantom hit applies no damage, but still applies any relevant status buildup and poise damage to the player. If your attack would have caused that player to bleed proc on that hit, then the bleed effect will still occur, causing them to get stunned for a tier 1 hit stun. However, they'll take no damage from the proc. Normally, a Colossal Sword will deal a level 3 hit stun whenever it lands a hit on another player. But if you land a phantom hit, then the opponent escapes the stun animation so early that they get a free punish against you in return. Against newer players, the Uggs can be a really oppressive weapon, being able to burst people down in a quick string of attacks that can feel impossible to escape. But against more experienced players, the weapon becomes 23 kilograms of liability, and putting bleed on the weapon just makes it that much easier for them to punish your attacks. Ultimately, You have access to both weapons, and if your personal preference is to go with the bleed-infused Uggs, then go for it. But I personally would recommend giving the Meteoric or Greatsword a shot. It does a ton of damage, has a great Ash of War, and is a lot of fun to use. Moog Spear is a great tool for invasions that allow you to deal damage and bleed buildup through walls, as it emits a large sphere of damage around your player. In certain environments, this can be an automatic win button, but outside of the L2, the weapon is pretty underwhelming. The main problem here is that the weapon's damage is split between fire and physical. What makes this such a problem is that one of the main attractions to using a Pierce-type weapon is access to counter-hit damage. Basically, anytime that an opposing player is mid-attack animation, their Pierce defenses are lowered by 15%, but since Moog Spear is split between fire and physical damage, only half the damage gets that bonus effect. Bloodfiend Spear, on the other hand, really works best with a build that invests heavily in Arcane rather than into strength or dexterity, but with such a high base requirement of 22 strength for the weapon, it gravitates more toward the strength arc hybrid. This weapon provides the highest amount of damage output amongst the great spears for Arcane builds, and has a very high bleed buildup at 110 for 45 Arcane. This works great either two-handed or power stance, where the power stance moveset applies enough bleed that it can proc in as little as 3 or 4 hits. When compared to the bleed-infused lance, the Bloodfiend Spear has less bleed buildup by 20 points, but much higher base damage, making this weapon generally a lot better than lances. However, there's 2 important reasons that you may want to consider running lances anyway. The Bloodfiend Spear are bugged, and when power stance, they have an incorrect amount of poise damage, similar to many other weapons that were added in Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. This makes your weapon deal only 122 poise damage with each spear. So, if you encounter someone running a really high poise, and you only hit them with one of the 2 spears, then they'll be able to tank your attack and counter in return. This does result in a funny interaction, where, due to how hitbox capsules work, if you stun a player with over 122 poise, then you'll get pushed back away from the player, making it really safe for them to roll away from you without much risk of getting roll caught. Personally, I actually think this is a really good thing, because 9 times out of 10, a player with really high poise will either try and mash or jump out of hit stun, as opposed to trying to get away. So this just helps with outspacing their potential mash and punishing it anytime they do. Another reason why you might want to consider running lances is that the extra 20 points of bleed is an important distinction where you can bleed someone in full verdigris in only 3 hits, where it would take 4 hits with the Bloodfiend Spear. So it's really up to you whether you want to use the Bloodfiends or lances, but in the majority of cases, Bloodfiends will always be the better bet. That's only to do with the somber weapons. For regular type weapons, pretty much everything that works well on a standard strength build will work great on a strength arcane hybrid. Namely, Starfists, Cleanrot, Halberds, Scythes, Sword Lance, Bloodfiend's Arm, and basically anything big and chunky. Strength arc builds really just have an incredible number of options for great weapon picks with incredibly high damage and versatility. And if you want a full breakdown on strength weapons in general, then I have a video where I go over how to fully optimize a fully kitted strength build on my channel. But specifically, when you mix strength with arcane, there's a few weapons that work better than others. Weapon types that greatly benefit from the access to status buildup include setups that have built-in true combos in their moveset, such as in the example of something like a Halberd, where you can land a true combo from using an R1 into an offhand attack with an offhand hand axe. This makes securing your bleed proc a lot more reliable, where if you land the first hit, then you can guarantee the second. But there are some other notable options as well. The Sword Lance has an R2 which can true combo into an R1, so long as the opponent is close enough to hit them. The R2 of this weapon comes equipped with Hyper Armor, allowing you to safely trade into your opponent's attacks to guarantee that the combo will land. It does a shitload of damage, and combined with the potential to bleed a player in as little as 3 hits, it's kind of insane. There's plenty of other weapons that have built-in true combos, such as the Knight's Greatsword, Colossal Swords, Scythes, so don't feel like you're limited to just picking 1 or 2 different setups. But a weapon doesn't need to have a built-in true combo in order to work well on this kind of build. A simple Cleanrot Knight Sword or Shamshir can do absolutely insane amounts of work with this type of build. The added status effects make these weapons generally great for keeping up pressure against an opponent, where the fast consecutive attacks can proc your status effects really quickly. These will do substantially less damage on an arcane build than they would do on a heavy infused strength build, but there are some ways to boost your damage to absurd levels, which I'll go over later in this video. To summarize the Strength Arcane build, 60 Vigor and 45 Arcane are your base requirements for your health and status buildup, based on the diminishing returns per point of investment. From there, invest into the minimum amount of dexterity that you need for access to all of your weapons that you want to use, probably around 16 to 18 dexterity, so that you can still have access to fundamental tools like great bows, light great swords, and great katanas. Then, push for your soft cap of 54 strength, and dump every other point into endurance. With this, you should have anywhere between 28 to 30 endurance available. You can boost this a little bit by locking yourself into an albinuric mask for an extra 4 points of arcane, letting you drop down to 41 points of invested arcane, and putting the extra ones into endurance. If you're having trouble trying to optimize the equipment, then I highly recommend using Amelia's build editing tool, a link for which will be down in the description. With this, you can test the numbers for your builds before spending a larval tier to reset all of your stats. That way, you can play around with the numbers and find what works best for you. Just put on the relevant weapons, armor, and talismans that you want to lock yourself into, go to the armor tab and run the calculator, which will tell you what combination of armor pieces will provide you the highest amount of defenses at any amount of poise that you want to meet. This gives me the Altered Beast Champion set, providing the highest amount of absorptions while still reaching 88 poise with Bulgo's Talisman, Greatjar's Arsenal, and a combination of any other 2 talismans like Blue Feather and Two-Handed Sword Talisman. However, this is only how I'd set this up if I really wanted access to the heaviest weapon in my inventory. Many of my weapons in my inventory are a whole lot lighter than the giant 22-pound rock that I'm carrying around, so I often have separate sets of gear ready to swap out to if I plan to use different weapons, especially ones that are a lot lighter. Preferably, I'll always try and get enough passive poise that I don't need Bulgo's Talisman in order to reach 88 poise, letting me be more flexible with which talismans I use. For this, something like the Albanur's Mask with Verdigris Armor, Veteran's Gauntlets, and Verdigris Legs will still bring me up to 88 passive poise, providing a very high amount of defenses and still give me plenty of good weapon options like Cleanrot Knight's Sword, Sword Lance, Bloodfiend's Great Spear, and Great Swords. But I'll be limited to my access for things like Scythes, Great Bows, and Hell Axe, unless I were to drop a bit of extra weight from my armor to make room for it. So it's really up to you how much micromanagement of your inventory you want to do, or if you want to be adaptable and just use whatever tools that you want without having to swap out your entire wardrobe in the process. For deciding how much poise that you want to invest into, there's a few major breakpoints to keep in mind. 88 poise is arguably the most important one, letting you have enough poise to avoid getting stunned by the second hit from two-handed small weapons, like Shamshir and Thrusting Sword. But some other really important breakpoints are at 97, to avoid getting stunned by the follow-up attacks from light greatswords, 111 to tank the first hit from one-handed small weapons, 116 to tank the second hit from one-handed heavy weapons, and 133 to tank a half hit from the R2s of light greatswords. It's really up to you how much you want to push into the defenses, and you can always sacrifice a bit of extra strength if it helps you reach a certain poise threshold that you're struggling to meet. What makes the Strength Arcane build so attractive is the 1.5 multiplier to the strength stat whenever you're two-handing, making hitting your damage soft caps a lot easier. The Dex Arcane variant doesn't have this luxury. The scaling on these weapons has 2 main soft caps being at either 56 or 80 points of investment. If you're trying to push for the 80 damage soft cap with Dex, then you end up having to sacrifice way too much in other stats in order to get there, while still trying to meet your soft caps on status build-up. So this build gets divided into 2 main routes. One is Dex laning, and aims to hit the 56 Dexterity soft cap on damage, while still meeting the 45 Arcane for status build-up, and the other runs heavy into Arcane, going for 80 points of investment. Unfortunately, by going from 45 to 80 Arcane, you're only getting about an extra 7 points of status buildup, so this really is just a question of how much damage you deal and what weapons you have access to. The Dexterity leaning route prioritizes using weapons like Rivers of Blood, Eleonora's Poleblade, Obsidian Lamina, and Morgoth's Curved Greatsword. While these weapons are certainly cool to look at, they're generally worse options than any of the Bleeder and Occult infused alternatives, where something like the Obsidian Lamina can get as high as 626 AR with 73 bleed at 56 Dex and 45 Arcane, but when compared to the Occult infused Scythe at 22 Dex and 80 Arcane, you hit 651 AR at 113 bleed. In general, it's almost always worth it to go more the Arcane leaning route, rather than the Dex leaning route. If there was any one reason that I would recommend running this version of the build, it would be for the Bleed Infused Light Greatsword. This on a Bleed Infusion reaches 511 AR with 108 bleed buildup, and has a unique property about its moveset that sets it apart from everything else. On all of its R2s, it has 2 instances of attacks, where the bleed buildup is split between them on the first and second hits, for 55 bleed buildup apiece. This might seem low, but the weapon has insane priority, ridiculous range, and high enough poise damage to break even hyper armor of most weapons with even just a half hit on his jumping R2. But the thing that makes this such a powerful weapon on Arcane builds is its interaction with phantom hits. As I explained before, a phantom hit applies no damage, but still applies any relevant status buildup and poise damage to the target. If your attack would have caused the player to bleed proc on that hit, then the bleed effect will still occur, causing them to get stunned at a tier 1 hit stun, though receiving no damage from the hit. But specifically with the Light Greatsword, if you cause a phantom proc on the first hit of any of your R2s, then it will stun the player long enough that they are forced to get hit by the follow-up attack. While a Bleed Infused LGS runs best on a Dex leaning Arcane build, it's so good that I'd even recommend it on a Strength Arcane version. But now let's talk about the Arcane leaning variant at 80 Arcane. This build suffers a bit of an identity crisis, as pretty much every Occult infused weapon would generally do more damage and have comparable status buildup, by simply running a keen infused version of that weapon with bleed grease, while using a pure dex build. That isn't to say that you shouldn't run this build though. A pair of Occult infused Nagakibas can still do an insane amount of work, even if the dexterity based counterparts might do a little extra damage by comparison. But there are a couple notable picks that really stand out. I talked about them already, but the Bloodfiend Spear are once again a highlight of this build variant. They don't function as well on the dex leaning variant, but when pushing for 80 Arcane, it's worth sparing the 22 points in strength to pick these up. While in the strength version, these Great Spears only run up to 609 AR, but they reach as high as 676 AR on this variant. Reduvia is a somber infused dagger that primarily scales with Arcane, and at 80 Arcane with 22 Dexterity, you reach 435 AR with 97 bleed. Let me make something perfectly clear. Daggers take a lot of time and practice to learn how to use them effectively, but with good fundamentals, they are one of the best weapon classes in the entire game, functioning exceptionally well either as a main hand option with their devastating R2s, or as an offhand weapon. You literally don't need anything else, just hold the dagger in your offhand, and as long as you play well, you can beat just about anyone. I'll be making a separate video in the future going into more detail about these weapons, but just to sort of paint the picture, I think you get the point. Ripple Blade and Ripple Halberd are unique weapons that have an S scaling in Arcane and no other stat. They come with no innate status buildup, but they can be greased with blood, sleep, or poison to get an insane amount of buildup with these status effects. A Ripple Blade with sleep grease will put most players to sleep in as little as 3 or 4 hits. While slept, the player receives higher level hits done from any damage dealt to them, letting you true combo a variety of different things that normally wouldn't be able to. My favorite being a hard swap to Reduvia, which lets you combo the L2 into a follow-up L2. Otherwise, just hitting them while they're asleep is easy and a reliable way to get guaranteed damage. And then there's Vari's Bouquet. This weapon is a meme. It's bad, but it's funny. And what's funnier than hitting someone over and over again with a bunch of flowers, and then murdering their health bar with a swap to something toxic like Reduvia, Executioner's Greatsword, or whatever other fun things that you can come up with. I always have a Vari's Bouquet somewhere in my inventory whenever I'm running an Arcane build, just because it's funny. For melee-focused builds, there are a few buffs that synergize really well together. Sacred Bloody Flesh is a DLC consumable that raises your Arcane by 10 and your attack power by 7% for 30 seconds. If you trigger blood loss either with seppuku or by bleeding a target, you'll get an extra 18% damage boost on top of that. However, there's a bug with this item, where if you override the effect of the Sacred Bloody Flesh with another consumable, like Exalted Flesh, then it will cancel the initial 7% attack power and 10 Arcane, but preserve the effect of the blood loss indefinitely, until you re-enter a loading screen. This is a bug that I learned about by watching a video from G9, where he explains this interaction, and if you want to see how he makes use of it in Invasions, then I'll have a link to his video in the description, where he explains it. You can couple the blood loss buff with a combination of other things, like the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, which further boosts your damage by another 12%, and then by another 6% with Vari's Mask. You can trigger all of these blood loss effects by using Seppuku on a weapon, which applies an extra flat 30 damage to your weapon, and an extra 30 points of bleed buildup that scales with Arcane. This is the easiest and most manageable way to boost your damage since all you have to worry about is applying bleed, which can be reapplied as fast as you're able to keep landing hits. Now, I can't talk about Seppuku without talking about the buff transfer glitch. This is a glitch that's been in Elden Ring since the game came out, and in more egregious forms, if you remember the old IGN glitch. The way this works is that anytime that you have an Ash of War that applies a status effect bonus to your weapon, and you swap to another weapon of the same type and same infusion, the buff that's applied to the former weapon will be carried over to the next. At least, the status effect will. You will not carry over the flat damage buff that you get from the Seppuku. So if you're using something like Poisonous Mist and swap it over to another weapon of the same type and start swinging, eventually you'll apply a poison proc, even though your weapon technically doesn't have poison buildup on it. The reason why this happens is that the opponent's client can't register that you've swapped weapons since you retain the same weapon model and the same infusion. Your opponent's game still thinks that you're holding the original weapon that used that initial buff. That said, this glitch only works in PvP and not PvE, and as soon as you try and buff the new weapon with something else, then the opponent's client will update and get rid of the initial buff. I'm not a huge fan of using these glitches, but they exist, and people will use them. And I'm not going to gatekeep them from you, but rather empower you with the knowledge that these glitches exist and what to look out for. Do with them what you will. And by all means, if you think that Bandai will listen, go submit a bug report. But there's a lot more damage that we can pump out of these builds than just with the bleed procs. There's 3 items that all synergize really well together based on poison and rot, which provide a massive boost to your damage as well, which can be easily stacked up alongside your buffs from the bleed effects. Kindred of Rot Exaltation provides an extra 20% damage boost, alongside the Mushroom Crown for an extra 10, and finally the Poison Hand, which when equipped in your offhand, will provide yet another 5%, giving you a total of 35% extra damage anytime that you apply poison. With everything combined, you're looking at a total of 80% bonus damage from all of these sources, and the process to activate them all really isn't all that bad. Just start with your Bloody Flesh, override it with Exalted Flesh, buff with Seppuku, heal back up with a Meat Dumpling, and then cleanse your poison with a Bolus. At that point, you've got 15 seconds left on all your buffs, and with a Thrusting Sword on the Strength Arcane build, you reach 1176 AR, and enough bleed buildup that you can do over 2000 damage in just 3 hits. With this, you can still reach all of your soft caps, you can hit 90 poise with Great Jar's Arsenal and Two-Handed Talisman, and the only downside to running a setup like this is that if you don't have the procs going, then you're doing pretty pitiful damage otherwise. In my opinion, it's generally better to have a more well-rounded build that emphasizes defensive talismans and utility, rather than trying to push your damage so high that under very specific conditions, you can effectively wipe someone off the map. Of course, this depends on your setting. In Invasions, this kind of a setup is really effective, where you're outnumbered 3 to 1, and getting killed quickly is essential, otherwise trying to fight your way out of bullet hell can sometimes be impossible. And finally, we get around to talking about the caster variant. I, myself, am not much of a caster. I much prefer melee combat, and sitting in the back line, throwing shit at people, and hoping that it lands, just isn't my style. So in terms of what spells that you use, it's really up to you, because realistically, there's only 5 spells out of the giant list that I've ever found that are actually useful. Instead, this will be focused on build optimization for your stat spread on scaling, casting speeds, and some essential tips that you'll want to keep in mind when leaning heavily into a caster playstyle. Arcane casters are one of the most stat-hungry build types available. The Dragon Communion Seal is really the only one that's of note for this kind of build. This gives you access to any kind of incantation, whether or not the incantation has an arcane requirement. For this build, the Prophet starting class works out best, as you're going to want at least 18 Faith for access to some specific incantations. The Dragon Communion Seal gets severe diminishing returns after 43 points of investment, where after reaching 43 Arcane, you'll get higher damage per point of investment by leveling your Faith stat. Once that also reaches 43, then you can go back to leveling your Arcane, which you'll get a linear amount of damage increase for every point that you invest. How many points you have available to dump into your Arcane comes down to what the rest of your kit looks like. With such high Arcane, I'd really recommend investing 13 points into Dexterity and 12 into Strength, so that you have access to offensive tools like Ripple Halberd and Reduvia. It's always a good idea to keep a dagger in hand at all times, since it can quickly turn the tide of a fight. I really can't stress this enough. The R2s from a dagger are absolutely devastating, and even a regular dagger can completely tear someone to shreds. Casting speed is calculated with a stat known as Virtual Dex, which caps out at 70 for a maximum casting speed. This number is really easy to achieve by simply equipping the Azure Glintstone staff in your offhand and putting on Radagon's Icon Talisman. You don't need to meet the requirements of the staff in order to gain its passive effect, it just needs to be on your hip in order for it to work. The casting speed is extremely important to me, these 2 items are non-negotiable. Aside from that, you have access to both Canvas Talismans for an increase of 12% of your spell damage, and for your last slot it's really up to you, but I'd recommend Great Jar's Arsenal. With this, you can reach 97 poise whenever you swap on the Bullgoat's Talisman, with a combination of Tree Sentinel armor and legs, Clean Rock Gauntlets, and the Lilbro Mask, giving you enough poise to tank the backswing from light greatswords and other small weapons. Otherwise, you could try running the Rakshasa set for an increase of 8% in extra damage. With this and 18 endurance with Great Jar's Arsenal, you can comfortably swap over to a Ripple Halberd if you need to. Your FP scales off of Mind, which really doesn't see any diminishing returns until 50 points of investment, which is way more than you'll ever need. So really, this is just your dump stat that you can flood points into after you reach your soft caps. With everything put together, your build should look a little like this: 60 Vigor, 60 Arcane with 43 Faith for the maximum damage from your Dragon Communion Seal, 12 Strength and 13 Dexterity for access to the weapons that you want to use, 18 Endurance for some decent armor, and the rest dumped into Mind. From here, let's talk about spells. The number 1 best spell in the game, above literally anything else, is Catch Flame. Catch Flame is extremely cost efficient, with only 10 FP per use, giving you 12 casts at 20 Mind. The standard cast is fairly slow at 22 frames at 10 virtual dex, or as fast as 17 frames at 70 VDex, which is the same speed as its running cast animation. The follow-up cast then chain at only 13 frames. What's important here is that the running attack has a much faster cancel window into follow-up casts of Catch Flame, and due to the lingering effect of the projectile from this spell, the running Catch Flame can true combo into a follow-up Catch Flame. Also, if you catch someone out of the air as they try and jump, then this will also result in them getting true comboed into a follow-up Catch Flame. This automatically makes this one of the best spells in the game, being faster than most weapons in the game and being able to true combo into itself. But it doesn't just end there. No amount of passive poise will ever prevent you from being stunned by this attack. And with each follow-up being only 13 frames, as long as you keep clicking the button, it is impossible for someone to mash out a hit stun from your initial cast in order to interrupt your follow-up. And I cannot even begin to tell you how many times someone just sat there and died because they repeatedly tried to mash out a hit stun from this pocket-sized nuke. The only response that your opponent has is to try and get away. It deals pure fire damage, allowing it to be buffed by the 15% from Flame Grant Me Strength, and another 12.5% with the Flame Shrouding Tier from your Physic. Take your Bloody Flesh, then boost your Arcane by a flat 10, and your attack power by 7%, such that with all of your talismans, armor, and these 3 buffs, you deal an extra 39.5% extra damage. But even without those extra buffs, your Catch Flame can still be hitting around 400 to 500 damage, letting you put down a fully geared player in just 4 hits, or 2 true combos. Still, there are some other spells that can provide some extra utility in various situations. First, Mari's Glintstone Breath. This is an amazing spell for invasions, and if you catch someone in the thick of it while they're unprepared, then they're pretty much a guaranteed kill. You're very vulnerable when using this due to the long casting time, but there's a very neat little trick that you can use. If you jump off an elevated position and use the spell, then you'll be held in the air for the duration of the cast, letting you use the terrain to your advantage. Otherwise, you can just blast this in a confined space and watch everybody burn. You can then boost this further with another Dragon Communion Seal in your offhand, instead of the Azure Glintstone Staff, and then adding the magic tier to your Physic for extra damage. But generally, that's not even necessary. The Roar of Regalia is another great tool to have in your kit, as a means of hitting players through walls. The first and second part of this spell combo into each other for a ton of damage. If you're getting run down or expect someone to push, then O-Flame and Bloodflame Talons are a great way to set up a trap for somebody to walk into, as each of these will allow you to set up a combo into, you guessed it, Catch Flame. In general, casters in Elden Ring are fundamentally broken, such that you really don't need any kind of skill to pilot this playstyle. You can just kind of spam shit from range and then punish them with an insane combo anytime they get close, forcing them to back off to mid-range again, where then if they give you enough space, then you can just refill your FP or throw out some garbage nukes that nukes them from a kilometer away. But there's a ton of spells and combos out there for you to try out. And at my core, I'm just a simple strength build enjoyer. So I encourage you to continue doing your own research, and feel free to let me know about any cool spells that provide niche utility that you think I should have included in this list. The goal of this video is to provide you with the tools and knowledge that you need to make an informed decision when it comes to your own build making. I plan to do future videos covering some of these weapon setups in a bit more detail, and I'll continuously be updating information as new things get discovered. But that's going to do it for this video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.